Yehoshua is with you?
Good morning. Yeah, Yeshua is here with us.
Good morning, Judge.
Good. Good morning, Yehoshua. Have a good week, Yehoshua. God should bless you.
Amen. Thank you. And the same.
God bless. Thanks.
Okay, so let's begin. You're on the bottom of, oops, what's going on here? Chav Testament Aleph, the bottom of 29a. So we'll remember that the Mishnah gives us a number of teachings, all of which are taught boy bayoim on that day. On that day, when Rabbi Gamliel was deposed as the leader, and in his place they put Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. A friend of mine pointed me to a commentary which says that all these teachings that were on that day don't necessarily mean that actual day, but rather in the in the days that followed as a result of that day. And it would make sense because there's quite a lot of things that the Gemara tells us were taught on that day. So this commentary explains, considering that Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah opened up the floodgates of scholarship, allowing for everybody to enter the study hall, as a result of that day, all of this was taught. So it doesn't necessarily mean that day, but rather in the days that followed, resulting from those events. At any rate, one of the teachings is from Rabbi Akiva, who said like this. The verse reads that when we'll use the example of sheretz or kli cheres, right? There's a unique law of the kli cheres. That is when purity is transferred from one item to the next, every item has a different manner by which, or there are different ways in which this purity can be transferred. By touch, by being under the same roof, by sitting on it, by carrying it. There's all kinds of manners in which impurity can be transferred. And depending on the item, depending on the material, depending on the type of impurity, there's many, many variables. Too many to make just one axis, with a vertical and horizontal axis. Way too many variables. At any rate, earthenware vessels, kli cheres, the way in which impurity is transferred is metame ba'aviroi. It becomes impure by the airspace. So as soon as impurity enters the airspace of an earthenware vessel, the earthenware vessel is impure. So the verse then says that the earthenware vessel, in turn, transfers that impurity to any food that might have been in that vessel. So you have the item, the impure item itself, which enters the airspace. You have then the vessel, it becomes impure. That's the rishon, that's the first degree. And then you have the kli cheres, the earthenware vessel, transferring the impurity to the second degree, to that.
This is in this week's parsha.
Yeah, it's discussed a bit in this week's parsha. That's right. So this item now, it's the second degree impurity, this food item that's inside the earthenware vessel, that didn't physically touch anything impure. And the physically impure thing didn't touch anything physically, actually. It was just in the airspace of the earthenware vessel. So the earthenware vessel became impure and then conferred the impurity to that food item. That food item is a second degree impurity, sheni. So said Rabbi Akiva, when the verse describes the impurity of that food item, the verse reads yitma. As opposed to saying tameh, it is impure, it says yitma, shall be impure. Another way to read this word yitma also could be active impurity. A yud, a prefix with the letter yud at the beginning, turns a description into an activity. So yitma then could be, it's actively impure. Thus says Rabbi Akiva, from here we can deduce that a second degree impurity transfers to a third degree impurity. This is what Rabbi Akiva taught. Now Rabbi Yeshua, when he heard the teaching from Rabbi Akiva, he said, Mi gale necha Rabbi Yochanan. who's going to remove the earth from your eyes? Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who was the teacher of these students, that generation of students, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon may be a little bit younger, next generation. And so is Rabbi Yehuda, the next generation. But that generation of students, Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Akiva.
Didn't we learn this about removing the dirt?
Yeah. I'm recapping the Mishnah. So Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Yeshua said, who would remove the dirt from your eyes, Rabbi Yochanan? Because you taught us this law that second degree impurity confers to third degree impurity. But you said then that there's going to become a generation. There's going to become a generation that's going to discount this law. And they're going to say it stops at number 2, it doesn't go to number 3. And the reason you said that is because there's no explicit verse to make this point that second degree impurity transfers to third. And because there's no explicit verse, there's going to come a generation that's going to reject the law. Now, if only you were here, Rabbi Yochanan, continues Rabbi Yeshua, to see your student Rabbi Akiva find a verse. That was the Mishnah. So what the Gemara is going to want to know now, this is going to be the exercise. It's an exercise in theoretics, but in this exercise, we can learn quite a bit of how the Gemara thinks. And various different principles of extrapolation we'll learn from this theoretical exercise. The exercise is, what Rabbi Yochanan thinking? On 2 accounts. Number 1, we need to understand, how did Rabbi Yochanan deduce the law that second degree impurity transfers to third degree impurity, if indeed there is no verse? Right? Rabbi Akiva found a verse, because when the verse describes a second degree impurity, it uses the word yitma. It uses the activated word rather than the passive descriptive word. But before that verse was discovered by Rabbi Akiva, or was interpreted by Rabbi Akiva in that way, Rabbi Yochanan said, I have no verse. So if he has no verse, why did he conclude that? Why did he indeed conclude that second degree impurity transfers to third degree impurity if he has no verse? That's the first level of the theoretical discussion we're going to have.
Yeah.
And then the second thing, sorry?
What did he use?
What exactly? What method of extrapolation did he use to get to the conclusion that second degree impurity confers to third degree impurity if he wasn't relying on the verse? And the second thing we'll understand is, what was the counter argument to that? Because Rabbi Yochanan said that there's going to be a generation that's going to reject what I'm teaching. What was the rejection? So we have to go to understand what was Rabbi Yochanan thinking in terms of how he concluded the second degree impurity will get to third degree impurity, will confer to third degree. And the second thing we'll have to understand is, what did he think would be the grounds for the people to reject his teaching? And then thirdly, we have to see, well, why didn't he take that rejection? Following?
Can you just repeat that last one?
He's going to have to make
What was the reason for the rejection?
What was the reason that Rabbi Yochanan would suspect that one day they're going to reject his reasoning? And why did he not accept that rejection? So this is the theoretical discussion we're going to have. Theoretical, because at the end of the day, we have now Rabbi Akiva's teaching who taught us the verse. So let's begin then. So again, like I mentioned, there are many different principles of impurity, but let's discuss 2 of them. Two of them. One principle is that, what was that? No, we're still here. One principle is, I thought something popped on my computer. One principle is that it's a principle we know already, but I'm just sharpening it, which is as the impurity gets conferred from one item to the next, in whatever degree it's supposed to get transferred. In this case, we only know of 2 so far. We're using 2 types of transference. One is the airspace within the earthenware vessel, and the second is by touch for everything else. But the first principle is, as something touches something else to make the other thing impure, it's the impurity slowly loses slowly loses its intensity. In halachic language, the last item to hold impurity but doesn't have the capacity to convert to the next would be called pasul. It has become invalid. We call it invalid because it stops here, as opposed to activated impurity that can then transfer to the next. Right? So as the degrees go down, at some point it ends. It can't confer any further. Rambam would use the word pasul. It's invalid rather than tameh, impure. Tameh, impure, could imply activation to the next, whereas pasul implies this is itself invalid. Unless you put the active word, like in the Gemara we'll use here, pasul, it causes something else to become pasul. But that's principle number one, which is the degrees of impurity gets less and less until the point where it stops, where it itself becomes invalid but doesn't convert to the next, right? This is what we're learning here. Does it go from second to third or not? The second principle is that when we say something is impure, it doesn't necessarily mean impure on every level. Meaning to say, there could be the same item that's the same distance degree of impurity from the original item of impurity, 2, 3, whatever it is, depending on the circumstances we'll learn. And this item, as it is right now, would not be considered impure with regard to ordinary food, chulin, ordinary kosher food, but it would be considered impure if this were truma. If this were the special tithe that the kohen is supposed to eat. Because that's a more spiritually sensitive food, therefore, it can retain impurity at a farther more removed degree than ordinary food. There's actually a third level.
It's almost like conditional impurity.
That's correct. It's so you can think of it, again, if we think about it as a spiritual virus, and it has various different pathways of transferring and so on, depending on what the medium is, it'll also depend on the sensitivity of the person's constitution. Right?
Like in this case, it would be.
So in this case, truma is a more spiritually sensitive food, and therefore is in some ways more susceptible to impurity. So the same degree of distance for ordinary food would not be impure, whereas for truma it would be. There's actually a third degree. Sorry? Has a lower immunity because it's a more spiritually sensitive food. That's right. We can think of it that way, yeah. There's actually a third layer, which is kachim. If this item, this food item, was actually food that belonged to the temple, was part of a korban, let's say. So it would be a third level. That's why there's so many variables. What is the object? Is it a human? Is it a vessel? Is it a food? Is it liquid? Is it solid? Then you have degree of distance. You have type of transference. Is it earthenware, not earthenware? You have, are you worried about, is it a truma issue? Is it a kachim issue? Is it an ordinary food issue? There are so many variables making it way too difficult to just make a simple axis. Like we did for carbon, we made 2 axes, right? It would be impossible to do it with truma. You'd have to have like those overlays.
Well, you'd have to have a lot of different lines with different colors.
Yeah. Much more complex. So those are the things necessary to understand our Gemara here. Is there anything else we should consider? Right. Another thing is, so one of so the one question is, what's the spiritual state of this item? Is it just ordinary? Is it truma? The food item, is it ordinary? Is it truma? Or is it kachim? Is it food of a korban? It's one element to think about. And the other element to think about is, the other variable here is it earthenware, not earthenware, telling us a difference in the way it transfers? Is it a human? Is it a food item? Okay, so let's begin a little bit. And maybe there's some more principles that I'm forgetting to introduce us to, but we'll get there. But I think this is good enough to start. So let's begin. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lines on the bottom. Last word. Meyacher, considering the fact, the ein loy considering the fact that Rabbi Yochanan acknowledges before Rabbi Akiva discovered this interpretation of the verse that tells us that a second degree impurity is activated to make something else impure. Right? Rabbi Akiva told us, the verse says, we said this earlier, impurity enters the airspace of an earthenware vessel. That earthenware vessel is degree number 1 of impurity. And then that degree of impurity transfers it to the food that's inside, number 2. The verse there used the active word, indicating, said Rabbi Akiva, that this second item, this food item, can then transfer to number 3. But Rabbi Shua told us that Rabbi Yochanan came to the same conclusion without a verse. So the Gemara asks, considering that Rabbi Yochanan didn't have any verse to conclude that second degree of impurity transfers to third, lama tameh, why indeed is it impure to the point that it can transfer to the third? If there's no verse, indeed, how did he come to this conclusion? So this is the theoretical exercise we have to do to think, how did Rabbi Yochanan come to this conclusion without any verse? Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, the teacher of these great scholars, the hero of the era of the destruction of the temple, as we discussed numerous times. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Rav, Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Rav, Min ha-Torah, from the text of the Torah, Ein loi. Rabbi Yochanan had not discovered and not found a way to deduce this law that second degree impurity transfers to third degree impurity. He did not have a way of concluding this law from the text of the scripture. But he used the extrapolation of how much of the more so, the kal v'chomer, the a fortiori. Now, the a fortiori we're going to do here is a little more complex than the usual. So usual a fortiori, usual how much to the more so, is where we have one item, which is ordinarily more lenient, and yet has a certain stringency. Then certainly that which is always stringent will also have that stringency with the lenient one has. Yeah? That's usually how it is. You have one item that's lenient, one item that's stringent. The lenient one contains one stringency. So certainly the stringent one will have that stringency. That's ordinarily how kal v'chomer operates. But here it's a little more complex. And this is a combination of two things creating a kal v'chomer. Meaning to say like this. We're going to look at each of these items, which are ordinarily lenient, and have a certain stringency. Right? Now, we're going to look at each of them and say, well, why is it stringent if it's ordinarily lenient? If the reason it's stringent is dependent on another principle that it has, then you couldn't use it to teach me anything about something else. The principle of kal v'chomer is that this is lenient, except for this one stringency. So certainly this one, the stringent one, will also have that stringency, right? But if this one stringency is dependent on another principle that this thing has, then I can't apply it anywhere else that doesn't have that principle.
Meaning the lenient position has a stringency from some other.
That's right. The lenient one, that's right. That's correct. The lenient one has a stringency that I'm trying to deduce to somewhere else, but that stringency is not just a stringency. And what's the logic of a kal v'chomer? The logic of a kal v'chomer is the very fact that the lenient one has a stringency indicates that that stringency should be universal because even the lenient one has it, right? Mm-hmm. And therefore it applies to the other one, which is stringent. But if that stringency is not universal, it's because of a different principle that this lenient item has. Then I cannot deduce it to somewhere else. But what you do is you find two lenient items that share that stringency, but they don't share any principle that would account for that stringency. Then I can apply the stringency somewhere else because it means it's universal. Mm-hmm. So if I have two lenient items that share one stringency, but they share no principle that would account for that stringency, then that indicates for us that that stringency is universal and I can make a kal v'chomer to somewhere else. So it's a kal v'chomer from two lenient items, not from one lenient item. Because each lenient item on its own wouldn't work considering they have a different principle that might have accounted for that stringency. Clear?
So you need to find another leniency that shares that same.
That's right. You find another lenient. That's right.
To apply it universally.
That's right. You find another lenient item.
Like it's only.
That's right. So that's what we're going to do today. He's going to introduce one. Then he can tell us, well, maybe the reason why it's stringent is because of a certain principle. Then we'll introduce another. So maybe that's why it's stringent because of another principle. But what's the commonality between the two of them? The commonality is they share no other principle except for the stringency. Must be universal. That's what the Gemara is going to do. It's not an uncommon way of Kal V'chomer, but it's definitely not as common as just the ordinary Kal V'chomer. But it's not an uncommon exercise in halacha. So let's see how far we can get in this exercise. Like this. Fourth line from the bottom of the page. Ma tful yoim. When it comes to a tful yoim, okay, now we're introducing another principle. There's a lot of principles. I don't know how far we're going to get today, but these principles are important to know. There are often 3 stages in the person's ritual purification. Not always, but there's sometimes 3 stages. The first stage is going to mikveh. Now, a person goes to mikveh. It's stage 1. He isn't fully pure yet. Now, the mikveh we do today, women's mikveh is specifically at night. But for most impurities, mikveh is during the day. But the person not fully pure until later that night. That's stage 2. So stage 1 is the person goes to mikveh. Stage 2 is evening sets. Head of Shemesh, the language. The sun sets. Stage 3 is the next day he brings a carbon. 3 stages of purification. Mikveh, sunset, and then the next day carbon. Now, in these 3 stages, the person becomes progressively more pure. And as he becomes progressively more pure, he can engage in eating those 3 levels we described earlier. And we described 3 levels of items that are less sensitive to impurity. So once the person has gone to mikveh, he can eat ordinary food. Right? If you wanted to eat chulin al taras hakodesh, if you wanted to eat ordinary food in state of purity, he can do so after mikveh, before nightfall. But in order to eat teruma, he has to wait for the evening. The next day, when he brings his carbon, then he can eat the 3rd level. He can eat food items from a carbon. Right? Remember those 3 levels of stuff in their spiritual sensitivity to impurity: ordinary food, truma, and kachim, items of a carbon. Those 3 foods become permissible to the person in those 3 stages of purification. This 3 stages of purification is not for every kind of impurity. Let's just assume it's the kind of impurity that requires these 3 stages. Mikveh, nightfall, next day carbon. After mikveh, he can eat ordinary food. After nightfall, he can eat truma. Next morning, after carbon, he can eat food items of carbon known as kachim. So now, matful yoim, what is the law of the person who's gone to the mikveh during the day? What can he eat? What can he eat? Shemutter b'chulin. He is allowed to eat regular food. But, poisel b'truma, he may not partake of truma until later that night. So this person, after mikvah, before nightfall, is called a tful yoim, a day mikvahized person. Tful means someone who's dunked, right? Someone who's been mikvahed, been dipped. But his yoim, it's during the day. So this tful yoim,
What's it called?
tful yoim, tes vez vav lamed, tful yod yud vav mem yoim. Tful yoim, he's gone to mikvah, but it's still daytime. That's what tful means. He's done his tefillah, he's done his dunking, he's done his submersion, right? Or immersion, where it comes up from the yeah, but it's still during the day. Okay, so matful yoim, this is someone who's a tful yoim. Shemutter b'chulin, he's allowed to eat ordinary food, but poisel b'truma is forbidden from eating any truma. So it's a leniency, right? Now, kikar sheni, this 2nd degree food item, right? There was some impurity entered the airspace of an earthenware vessel. The earthenware vessel itself is first degree. The food item is second degree. The food item that the earthenware vessel is touching is second degree. That second degree impurity is poisel b'chulin. You cannot eat it even as chulin, even as ordinary food. It would be considered impure. So it's more strict than the teful yom. The teful yom, the person is waiting for the evening, may eat chulin, but can't eat truma. Right? Not just he can't eat truma. Poisel with truma. If he were to touch truma, he would confer impurity on it. Right? So he's allowed to eat chulin.
Wait,
but
he's not to eat what?
The teful yom can eat ordinary food, chulin, but he would confer impurity to truma because the night hasn't set yet.
Right.
So now this second degree item, who is forbidden in chulin, it's a forbidden food even regarding chulin. It's considered truma. It's considered tamei pure. How much more so it can confer in a din shiasa shlishi b'truma? How much more so it could confer third degree in truma? I think someone's in the office now.
It's not 9 o'clock yet.
So I think someone got it already, no?
Yeah.
Okay. Maybe not.
Please.
Yeah, you follow that already? No.
No, I missed it. Sorry.
Okay, let's review it again. So it's a lot of principles and details to remember.
Yeah.
So the teful yom,
Yeah.
he's gone to the mikveh today.
He hasn't gone. It's not nightfall.
Not nightfall yet. He's allowed to eat regular chulin.
Chulin means what again?
Chulin means ordinary food. From the word choil. Choil means like mundane. Choil, like weekday means
You
choil.
can eat ordinary food, meaning second degree impurity food.
No, he can eat regular food without making anything impure, without conferring any impurity yet. Right? Without conferring any impurity because he's gone to mikveh. But he cannot eat truma because he would confer impurity there. Because truma is more sensitive, spiritual.
Right.
Yeah? So now okay, so compare that. The teful yom, chulin, yes. Truma, no. This second degree impurity, this food item that's second degree impurity, right? It's in an earthenware vessel. Impurity went into the airspace of the earthenware vessel. Earthenware vessel is number one. It conferred to the food that's inside of it, number two. This impure item is impure even with regard to chulin, even with regard to ordinary food. So it's more strict than the teful yom. Because the teful yom is pure as far as ordinary food goes. Right? The teful yom is pure as far as ordinary food goes. But this second degree food is impure as far as ordinary food goes. The Torah says it becomes impure. Follow it? No.
Yeah.
So it's more strict. And yet this lenient one, the one that's pure for chulin, is impure for truma. Yeah? No, yes or no?
I'm listening. Sorry.
Sorry. Okay, just ignore the phone.
The phone is
Ignore it. Someone will take care of it. Ignore it. So, again, this person who's waiting, who went to mikvah, is waiting for nightfall.
Yeah.
As far as chulin goes, he is pure.
Okay.
As far as truma goes, he is impure.
Okay.
So it's the lenient one.
Yeah.
This food item, who's second degree impure, with regard to chulin, is impure. So it's more strict than the teful yom.
Yeah.
So much more so it will confer impurity to a truma, number 3. It won't confer impurity for ordinary food, number 3, but it will confer impurity to truma, number 3. Okay. That's all. The guy who is allowed to eat chulin still confers impurity to truma. How much more so this item, which is impure as far as chulin goes, certainly it's going to confer impurity to truma. That's the kal v'chomer. Lots of principles to get to this one point. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, let's stop over here, Rabbi. I hope we're going to be able to pick up tomorrow and continue because we're in the middle of like a.
No, we get.
Yeah, but the principles are solid. So remember the terminology because tomorrow I'm just going to go straight to the terminology, right? Chulin is ordinary food. Truma, those are the 2 ones that are important here. Teful yom, the person who's gone to mikvah, nightfall hasn't come yet. This person can eat chulin, but he would confer impurity to truma.
What is food that has second degree impurity called? Is there a name for it?
That would be sheni, but sheni,
It's
sheni,
called
sheni, it's a second degree impurity.
Okay.
And then shlishi. But this is sheni of chulin, even. It's possible chulin also. It's a sheni, it's a second degree impurity, which is impure for chulin too. So certainly it could confer 3 to truma. If the Tulyayim, who is okay with chulin, he confers to truma. Certainly the second degree, which is not okay for chulin, certainly it confers impurity for truma. Okay, this is where we are right now. But again, we're going to counteract that, introduce another item which also shares that stringency, which is that it transfers from second degree to third degree. And between the combined principles, we're going to make a kavachemer.
So that's what Rabbi Yochanan
Was thinking.
relied on.
Yeah, and then we're going to see the counter argument and why Rabbi Yochanan rejects the counter argument. Okay, so let's have these principles clear, and hopefully we'll be able to build on them tomorrow.
Thank you.
Okay, wonderful day.
Rabbi, Rabbi, thank you so much. You can take off the recording. If you have a few moments, I'd like to mention something to you.